Hi, everyone. Another commonly asserted thing that I've seen lately is that asymptomatic people are not infectious and do not transmit COVID. So testing asymptomatic people or quarantining asymptomatic people is totally unnecessary. I'm not sure why this is being asserted again, because we've known for a long time that asymptomatic people shed virus and can infect other people. This was back in July of 2020. Well, it's only been fairly recently that it's been completely nailed down, but it's been suspected and kind of accepted as how it works for a long time. So this is a paper from July of 2020, and they're basically talking about when they looked at the evidence at that time, there were many reports of people interacting with asymptomatic people and getting infected. So like when you did contact tracing on these people that got infected, they were like, "Well, I was never around anyone that was having any symptoms." But they would go back and find out, oh, there was this one family member that was completely asymptomatic who gave it to them, or they went to some place where an asymptomatic person. So there were many contact tracing and epidemiologic evidence that showed that people had been around other people that had the virus but were completely asymptomatic, and they got symptomatic disease from these asymptomatic people. Okay, so there was a lot of epidemiologic data that seemed to indicate that, but there wasn't any molecular data at that point. So then the next thing came in November of 2020, and this is a study out of Korea where they showed about 303 people that got COVID infection in a community treatment center, and a large proportion of them, like almost 40%, were asymptomatic at the time of isolation. And then some of them eventually developed symptoms, so they would be actually classified as pre-symptomatic. But that means at the time that they didn't have any symptoms at all. So from a practical standpoint, they were asymptomatic. And so what they found out at these asymptomatic people had viral load that was similar to that of the symptomatic patients. So there wasn't any big difference in the viral load. So they were theoretically just as infectious as symptomatic people. Then the next paper was in November, and this was in China, and they had kind of the similar thing. So they basically had 9 asymptomatic patients and 9 patients with mild symptoms. And when they went through them, the detectable antibodies and RNA were simultaneously found in the asymptomatic people. Again, another paper found that upper respiratory viral load was similar between asymptomatic and mildly symptomatic patients. Now, the problem until recently that everyone was saying is that all this research basically was based on PCR data, and PCR isn't exactly the same as virus. So PCR just looks for the genome, and it could be dead virus. It could be virus that doesn't work. So that was the argument. How do you know that these PCR results indicate actual viable virus? So someone actually did that study and published it in May of this year. And so their abstract kind of talks to that fact. So information regarding the infectivity of SARS in asymptomatic carriers is scarce. In order to determine the duration of infectivity in correlation with RT-PCR results and time since initial positive PCR test, we evaluated SARS-CoV-2 cell infectivity in nasopharyngeal samples longitudinally obtained from asymptomatic carriers who disembarked from a cruise ship during a COVID-19 outbreak. Of 166 nasopharyngeal samples collected from 39 asymptomatic carriers every 48 hours until 2 consecutive negative PCR test results were obtained, SARS-CoV-2 was successfully obtained from 9 positive PCR samples obtained from 7 people. Viable viruses were isolated predominantly within 7 days of the initial positive PCR test. So that means within the first 7 days is when you're getting the most viable viruses. So these people didn't do a PCR test. They actually got viruses and checked them in cell culture, made sure that they infected cells. So this kind of just nails it down, that asymptomatic people shed viable virus. So anyways, it's very clear. I will link these papers below in the description, but asymptomatic people, they do make viable virus and they can infect others. And the people that are saying that that's not the case, I don't know where they're getting their information from, but these are papers that show that absolutely that can happen.